But my job is to introduce Heidi, and I didn't know that I was supposed to do that. But we've only been friends for 25, 30, I don't know how many years. But I first got to know her when I went across the river to Hastings to do some artwork stuff. And she was involved in the arts group because we were meeting over at the Leduc Mansion. And Heidi has been consistently helping out, doing history. I don't know what your official title was there at Leduc, but you're still doing stuff there. And working for the city as the historian, and working for HPAC, the Hastings Prescott Area Arts Council, and keeping life going for the 25 years that I've known you. I'm very proud to be your friend, and thank you for being here.
Yes, I just wanted to say a very quick welcome to all of you. I'm Linda Shank. I'm the operations director here, and we are proud to partner with BAIC and with the community education. This is wonderful. Look at everybody. So very happy to have you with us. And I hope to see you at future events here as well. We have a packed spring, summer, and fall schedule of events, so please come back. And again, thank you so much for coming today. We're happy to have you. So enjoy.
Okay, so you see my title is Community Connection, so we're still doing it. I'm going to tell you the history about these communities between Hastings, Prescott, and Trimbelle, and also Point Douglas in between. So we're going to actually start out, I'm a member of BR4R, and I was doing research and history when I was at the Leduc House. I started there as a tour guide, and there was a resident of the Leduc family who came back after the war, after the Civil War with Mr. Leduc. His name was George Daniels. And I started researching him for that, for our interpretation there. And then wondered, well, he came from Georgia to Minnesota, it was cold, and everybody was white. What was that like for him? So I went down to City Hall in Hastings, where we have what we call the Pioneer Room, and the history of Hastings is preserved there. So fortunately, I was very pleasantly surprised to find out there was a very active community there when George showed up in 1865. And so I've been researching that ever since, and that was in 2006. So I keep adding to my repertoire and what I know. And we do a lot of interpretation with Building Remembrance for Reconciliation. We believe in telling these stories and getting them out to the public. And some of them are very joyful stories and some not so much. But I'm going to start out with a celebration. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about these communities. You're all from this area, so you probably understand the location of Trimbelle to Hastings. That's quite a ways. Although back then, they didn't have to cross the river and go over Highway 61 comes around and comes back down. They crossed the river down a little bit lower and came out in Point Douglas, and then just did a ferry across to Point Douglas and then another ferry over to Prescott, and then took it over to Trimbelle. The reason I'm telling you this is because the Hastings paper were so fortunate that someone had the foresight. Ethel Thieling was a librarian, and she started clipping articles out of the old papers. And we don't believe in segregation mostly, but I was happy that she segregated the black history from the white history in this instance. It would have been totally lost if she had not done that. And there are files there, blacks in Hastings, and if there was ever any information about black articles in their paper referring to the black community, they went in there. She began to know the names of the black families in town. They went in there. So research was really helped with that. wasn't it, James? And so we were fortunate for that person being so farsighted. So this is a picture of Hastings 2nd Street in the early days. I like to picture that because the article that was written on August 6th of 1863 that was printed in the Hastings Gazette, I'm going to read it because I love the way some of the words they used and the descriptions. So the author, the reporter said, "On Tuesday morning last, we were considerably surprised to see the colored population of our own city, as well as from other points, parading the streets in their best store clothes. Of course, this unusual display of ebony and ivory broadcloth and cambric attracted our attention, and we made inquiry as to the cause of the display. We were gratified. The colored people had been celebrating the anniversary of the emancipation of slavery in the British Dominion at Trimbelle, Wisconsin, where a dinner was prepared, speeches delivered, and toasts and responses uttered, and a general good time had by the gentlemen and ladies of American descent." So I thought, first of all, I was so amazed that they had to walk every place they went, that they ended up celebrating all the way over in Trimbelle and came back to Hastings and were parading on the streets. So I started thinking about how that was, and Dorothy Algren and I talked a lot through my years of research because, of course, she knew a lot of the history from here. So she told me about the Washingtons, Lewis Washington. It was a family that lived in Trimbelle, and on the census records, also, a lot of credit goes to Ancestry. I don't know how people taught or learned history or the stories before Ancestry, because looking at the census records, I could tell there was a block of about 6 farmers that lived in a real cluster of black citizens. And this was in 1863, so they had obviously been freed for a while. And they had prepared that meal and had their celebration at those places. So it was Lewis Washington and his family. So then next we learned that in 1864, the black men of Hastings held a meeting to discuss applying for themselves to be able to vote. They considered themselves citizens, and yet the word white was keeping them from being able to vote. So they had a meeting, and J.H. Brooks and R.S. Burns and A.J. Overall, all barbers, were appointed as a committee to draft a petition that would be presented to others to sign, asking that that word white be taken out of the amendment for voting. And then Charles Griswold, the legislator from Winona, introduced their petition with one from Winona and one from Rochester. And at the time, both houses of the legislature passed a bill that proposed that amendment, and then the proposed amendment was on the ballot in 1865. But it failed. And then it was on the ballot each year until it finally did pass in 1868. But during those years that they were waiting for it to pass, there was a growing community of blacks in between the different communities. And I'm showing the barbers were very active. They had their businesses downtown Hastings on Main Street. They took out ads in the paper. They moved from one hotel to another. There was always a little reference in the paper that Taylor just left Tremont Hotel and he's now located over in Reed's Hotel, that type of thing. They were always bettering themselves. And then this is a picture of George Washington Daniels, who was one of the people who came to Hastings after the Civil War. So now the people, the men and their families that served in the Civil War are coming into Hastings and Prescott. So in Hastings we had George Daniels. He came with Mr. Leduc, who was a general, and he was a quartermaster. And Daniels had been in the Confederate Army, and he escaped by pretending to be dead. And then after they kicked him over as dead and left him lie there, he met up with Mr. Leduc and served in the Union Army. At the end of the Civil War, he was hired by Leduc to come to Hastings, and he worked on the farm there. And he ended up marrying Cornelia Morgan from Prescott, and they were married for a number of years. They were divorced, and then he married Chloe Hudson from Prescott. So that connection between Hastings and Prescott was very active. John and Nancy and James Wallace came after the war. They lived in Hastings, and Abraham Davenport also served in the Union Army and ended up in Hastings. In Prescott, we had Alexander Strayhorn, Samuel Golden, Henry St. Clair, and Julia Porter. Alexander Strayhorn married a young woman by the name of Narcissa. She died at an early age after having 4 children, so he raised the children himself. Samuel Golden and Alexander Strayhorn had come together. Strayhorn was born as a slave in North Carolina, and during the Civil War he had gone to Tennessee, where he met up with the 12th Wisconsin Regiment, and then he came here with Samuel Golden and other former slaves whose names, I don't know which ones they were that came with him. So he came to Prescott they came to Prescott with the returning soldiers. And Alexander was a part-time preacher, and for a while was in charge of Brown's Chapel, which I'll talk about in a little bit. They said he was an exceptionally good speaker. It was said he could move the audience to tears when recounting slavery days. And Samuel Golden never married, but he stayed very close friends with the Strayhorn family. Henry St. Clair, I could not find his history if he served in the Civil War or not, but he ended up in Wisconsin, and he married Julia Porter, who was living in Prescott and already had a daughter. And then they married, and their first 2 children were born in Wisconsin, and then they moved over to Hastings, and they lived near to the Daniels family and the Leduc family. So, in the meantime, that amendment was being voted on. It finally passed in 1868. So January 1st of 1869, there was a grand mass meeting of, you can see here, colored people of Minnesota, and everyone was all invited to that meeting. And so the people that I just mentioned would have been here. It's very likely they were among those who joined that, because they said the trains were full coming from Red Wing and Hastings and Prescott, Wisconsin. They met at Ingersoll Hall, which was in St. Paul. They had an amazing program, which they published in the proceedings of the convention of the colored citizens. And I find it very interesting that in that program, they list all of the speakers, and you'll notice the governor's there, the mayors are there, and look at who was last, Mr. Washington. Mr. Washington from Trimbelle, Wisconsin. And while they were, they elected officers for the convention, and among those were 3 of the people from Hastings, and Andy Sanderlin was a barber who was on the first census record in 1857, as was R.S. Burns, and then Jackson Overall, and Brooks Burns was part of it, and Brooks. So they were well represented. Hastings was well represented. But I love this part. Reading that was sort of dry, but I just was interested in how they did this convention, and I was so rewarded, because look at this great description. I don't have a picture of Mr. Washington's face, but from this I have a picture of his personality. They say Mr. Washington from Trimbelle was then called on, and he responded in a speech somewhat unpolished, but full of wit, common sense, and telling hits that went to the heart of the audience. But they couldn't report it. The other speeches they printed out verbatim, most likely because it was written down and they could pass it out. He spoke from the heart. He just said what came to him. And so he reviewed the past history of struggles of the Friends of the Slave and the conflicts to secure their rights. His remarks were pointed with capital illustrations that produced expressions of laughter and applause. I wish they had preserved those illustrations. It would be really, really fun to see. So that's a little bit about the neighbors from Trimbelle that I found on my research. So as you saw from the initial part, that a lot of the activism for their rights initiated with the barbers. And I believe that was because the barbers had access to hearing all the news. They had men came in and they would sit and talk, because it's amazing to me that they knew it was the 30th anniversary of the emancipation of the slaves in British colonies. They, of course, knew that the emancipation had been in our country. Lincoln had declared that in January of 1863. So when they were celebrating, they knew what the current events were. They knew what was happening. And they were activists. Actually in 1875, A.J. Overall decided Sumner had always been a very good friend of the black people. But he decided they weren't going to go with Sumner, who was pushing for the Democratic, I forget who was that year. And it was the guy that says, "Go west, young man, go west." And
Horace Greeley.
thank you. Sometimes they don't. So, but you can see they sent this petition around, and the men, Overalls, Barber, Taylor, Barber, Haywood Hope, Barber, and George Daniels is on here, John Wallace is on here, Abraham Davenport. They all signed this petition to vote Republican and not follow with Sumner's recommendation. And then the different things that they would do, they were bettering themselves. They formed a temperance society for all the black citizens. They had a literary committee, gathering, where they would study things to better their knowledge. And so this one in 1875, where this was printed in the Stillwater Gazette, where the tone of this article is very mocking about them celebrating together, white and black people together. And what they were celebrating was the passage of the Civil Rights Law in 1875. I researched that to find out what it was about. It's very interesting. It was about transportation and many rights that the blacks didn't have at the time. But in 1883, they did away with it. So they'd gain a little bit, and then they would lose it. And John Wallace was one of the people who was very active in Hastings, and he was, in 1880, the census record in 1880, there were no longer any black barbers. White barbers had moved in and taken over that trade. A.J. Jackson overall moved to St. Paul. He died a year later. Wesley Taylor, who was very active in Hastings and all of the civil rights activist things, was living here in Prescott with his wife Millie and their adopted son. George and Chloe Daniels moved away out of Hastings and moved down to southern Minnesota and eventually South Dakota. But taking their places were the Wallace and Curry families. John and Nancy Wallace had come here from Lakeville between the 1865 census and the 1870 census, they were living in Hastings on 4th Street. Then Nancy's niece and her husband and their two small daughters moved in here to Hastings in 1885, moved into the Wallace house until Mr. Curry was able to accumulate enough money to buy a couple lots, and he built a house, and then he bought 6 more lots, and he had a small farm on that property. The house is still there on the corner of 4th and Tyler, and the Wallace house is kitty corner from it, still on that same corner. So the most of the black families were worshiping at the Methodist church at the time. The Methodist church is on the corner of 8th and Vermilion Streets, and this little frame church still is there today, and that was the church that they attended. There were a couple incidents where they were uncomfortable with, for instance, the Curry children were coming down the aisle and going up to be christened or something, and some children called out, "Oh, look at it," and so for some reasons, maybe that was one of them, but also that the African Methodist Episcopal Church from Iowa had commissioned J.C. Anderson, who was a pastor of that church, to come to Hastings and start a congregation. So there was a meeting at the John and Nancy Wallace house in October of 1890, where they formed that community with J.C. Anderson, and the Wallace and Curry men were elected as officials of the church. Julia St. Clair and her husband Henry were both there. They were founding members of the church. I got that from an obituary. And so they started their congregation, and at first they would meet in each other's homes. Eventually, they started meeting on the 2nd floor of the Hanson block. It was a grocery store on the bottom, and then offices and such on the 2nd floor. Well, on December 26th in 1891, Reverend Anderson published a letter in the Hastings Gazette talking about the background of forming the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He explained about how they'd been meeting in homes and then eventually in the rented rooms on the upper floor of Hanson's block. But he said, "Experience has taught us the necessity of having a place of our own where we may become permanently situated and worship God according to the dictates of our own conscience, without shame or fear." He ended the letter with a request for support, and they wanted to raise $200 for the down payment. Samuel Golden from Prescott also wrote a letter around the same time requesting funds, and then thanking people for the funds, which turned me on to his name, and I discovered that at first I thought he was just like a white attorney from Prescott that they were working with, but then I discovered Samuel's history later on when one day I was looking at I think when I was going to talk to this part of this group on a Zoom meeting a while ago, and I wanted to see how many people black people were from Prescott, and I found Samuel Golden. It was sort of an interesting discovery for me. And what I thought I liked about this too was that when Mr. Reverend Anderson wrote this to the people, or the letter to the editor, he addressed it to the good people of Hastings, Prescott, and Point Douglas. He said, "There are many among you who do not have a place of their own to worship," which triggered my sense that this community existed, and that Brown's Chapel was more than just the Hastings population. So the people responded to the request for funds. The $200 was acquired, and there was a Baptist German church that was for sale for $500 on the corner of 5th and Sibley in Hastings. They were able to purchase that small little frame church and began to have their services. The church opened on October 1892, just 2 years after it was formed as a congregation, and it was celebrated all day long that Sunday. People from the pastors and choirs from 3 of the Hastings churches, the Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church, and the Methodist Church, where they had been going, all contributed and took part in the celebrations, as well as pastors from other African Methodist Episcopal churches in St. Paul and Minneapolis, and their choirs as well. So the community now had a place of their own to worship. It was a gathering spot, and we know that through the years, there were a lot of weddings and funerals located there. One of the things just newly discovered, this was an amazing discovery. An intern that was working with James Curry on his fellowship up at Dakota County Historical Society discovered this. Her name is Reverend Mrs. L.A. Reagan. Her name is Lena, and discovered that she was a pastor she was an ordained African Methodist Episcopal pastor in 1900, and that she was assigned to Hastings. So she was born in 1853 in Missouri and had been active in the AME church since she was a girl, and she married Reverend Robert Reagan of St. Peter's AME in Minneapolis in 1891. And then after the marriage, it says she just went around and evangelized at different churches until she was appointed to be the pastor of Brown's Chapel around 1900. And Lena was, she had a huge 10-day camp meeting at the church, on the church grounds in the summer of 1900. And the spokesman recorder from Minneapolis printed this great report about it. They said that it was, the 10-day camp meeting was a spiritual, financial success, allowing, they had seating allowing for 300 people, and they were unable to accommodate them all. That's how well attended it was. Partially because there was a young man who drew everybody's attention. His name was Harry Killebrew. That was interesting. Harry, and a lot of people followed him, I guess, as a speaker. So I thought, we think this is interesting. In the 1900 census, Ms. Reagan listed her occupation as demonstrator, as in activist, not demonstrator. And I mean, how forward was she? And as a champion of black women's issues, she worked to establish an industrial school for orphan girls and a nursing home for the elderly. In 1901, in an open letter to the public published in the Appeal, Reverend Reagan said, "Have you ever stopped to think that the only place for the aged women of our race is the poor farm, and the only places for our homeless and orphan children are the state school and reformatory institutions where they get no training and very little of anything else. The only hope of our race lies in the education and training of our children." So Lena was an asset to the communities where she lived, and we were fortunate, Brown's Chapel was fortunate to have her there in Hastings for a while. We don't know how long she served there, but she passed away in 1914 in Grand Forks, North Dakota, and the obituary said that she stayed active with her preaching nearly to the end. A little footnote, a nice big article that was written up in the Minneapolis paper, the Hastings Gazette, said, "The colored camp meeting closed Thursday night with an ice cream social." Period. So good thing we didn't have to just rely on Hastings for that news. So the community was going about their daily lives. They were living where the two families that had the most children at the time, the Wallace and Curry families, where they lived up at on 4th Street. There was quite a ways out of town. It was like country. And so they had, there were a few other families that lived along there of black descent, but otherwise they were from, they called it Sweet Hill, that area. So there were a lot of Swedish people, German, it was a mixed, and they seemed to all get along well. In fact, in the middle of this front row, you can see James Wallace is the man with the white collar that's sort of showing in the center. And actually, both of them have white on. This is William Douglas, and this is James Wallace. He's the son of John and Nancy Wallace. James Wallace and his wife, Ella, had 7 children. And the Currys, who I talked about before, had 10 children. So they had the largest part of the community in those 2 households. Goodman was a musician. He played in the Hastings Brass Band. He actually was a writer, and he had written a song that was published, My Gal Sal, and it was printed and it was for sale in the Hastings Music Store, according to the Hastings paper. And this is a photo. The Curry children were very active in school. They were in the sports. They were good students. This is a photo that shows Paul Curry, who's the captain of the team, and he was also captain of, this happens to be a basketball team, but he was also captain of football teams. And the young man in the corner over here is Robert Wallace. Now they're cousins once removed, because Mrs. Wallace and Mrs. Curry were aunt and niece, and so they're like cousins once removed, and neighbors, and so I'm sure they got along quite well. Or I would hope they did. And this photo is of the graduation class of 1905. You see, this is Florence Curry. Florence was the valedictorian of her class. She went on to school and became a librarian. She went to Tuskegee, Illinois for her degree, and then she went back to Virginia, Hampton, and she taught there, or worked there as a librarian for a while, and then she met and married a man. His last name was Simmons, and he was part of the agricultural classes or department at that college. Unfortunately, she died quite young. She's buried in Hastings at the Lakeside Cemetery, as are other members of that family. So the families, the Leduc, not the Leduc, pardon me, the Currys, the Wallaces, and then another family that I haven't developed a lot for this was the Weldon family, and they have just such an interesting history as well. Mrs. Weldon, Mr. Weldon was born a slave in Missouri, was given his freedom at the time of his master's death, and moved from Missouri to Michigan. When the Civil War started, he joined up with the Michigan colored troops and served in the Union Army. He was married and had 1 son, and then he eventually must have gotten a divorce. I couldn't find the papers, but he came to Minnesota, where he met and married Rosa Moran. Rosa's uncle was Chief Little Crow, and so they had this mixed marriage of Native and Black combined, and they left Minnesota, this metro area of our place, and went to West and had a farm for a while, and then they moved back and raised their children here. Some of their children were in the Hastings School, and they also were members of Brown's Chapel. So, these are, looking at this photo, we have, they say Mrs. Weldon is one of the people up there, Mrs. Wallace. The Currys are on this photo. John Wallace is way on that end with a top hat. And this is Reverend Anderson right here with the top hat. And then we have, as you saw before, this is James Wallace and his wife Ella, and this is John Goodman. So, sadly, on late October of 1907, Brown's Chapel was destroyed by an arson. Both Hastings papers, the Hastings Independent and the Hastings Gazette, reported that the fire had been started on purpose. Someone had cut the screen, raised the sash, and gained entrance into the church. They poured kerosene on the pews and the floors and up against the walls and lit it on fire. The fire department was called. It saved the building from being burnt to the ground, but the windows were broken. There was so much damage that this population could not afford to rebuild and redo that church. So, as a result of that arson, they were left without their place of worship, their place of gathering, their own place where they could be together as people and sing and act and just be together. So that was a great loss for that population. The thing that is really sad on top of all that is that we looked at all the Hastings papers that we have now. We have the bound copies of the Hastings Gazettes at the Pioneer Room. There was never any mention of that church, of that community losing their church, or any investigation into how that fire was started. And so there was a real silence around that, very much not acknowledged, or we have no idea what happened on a private level, if people reached out to them and offered condolences or came aside and supported them in any way. We don't know. It's a vacuum in our information. We'll never know because the people who could have told us those stories are long gone. And there, as I said, there was nothing printed in the paper. What we do have is a hearsay. Another historian from years back, she's no longer with us, overheard a man at one of her cocktail parties bragging about, owning up to the fact that when he was a young kid, he and his buddy had started that fire in that church. The thing about it is, looking at the census records, those boys were only 5 and 4 years old at that time. They could not have climbed up and cut that screen and raised that sash unless someone older was with them, helping them. So it's still a mystery, we'll never know. It's just a sad thing for our community to know that there was this idea that it was okay to burn that church and then never to talk about it or to reconcile it. It was every few years, later on, stories would be written during February in the Hastings Gazette about the fact that there was a black community in Hastings and that they had a church. They didn't really focus much on the fact that the church was destroyed by fire, but they talked about the community. But that was pretty much it. And so that's a little bit how BR4R got started. I was working with Rich Mankey, who had a position at Lakeside Cemetery, and we were working on the sesquicentennial of that cemetery, and it was founded by women. And women had gotten the corporation started and everything, which was pretty unique in the 1860s. And I had done a lot of research on women's history. So Rich and I were walking around one day, and he asked me about the black population. So I shared with him some of the things I'd written about this. And he took this on. He was just so appalled by the idea that their church had been burned. And so because of Rich, our group sort of came out of that he read a book by James Lowen called Sundown Towns, and started looking into how many towns, white towns that were in Hastings or in Minnesota that there were, and so BR4 came out of that. But I sort of jumped ahead of myself right there. So after their church was burned, they lose their own place for worship. They go back to the Methodist church that had been good to them, and pretty much they were comfortable there. So that was where they went back to worship. And then in the mid-20s, the KKK became active again. And it was a time that they were very much against immigration. You historians here know all this. They were against immigration. They were also anti-Catholic, which was sort of interesting. And of course, blacks still were their target. But in Hastings, the KKK was more targeting. There were some crosses. I couldn't believe it when I heard that it was active in Hastings. It was like, went down to the Pioneer Room again, favorite place to find stuff out, and Dick Garza, who worked there, said, "Oh yeah, there's a whole file on it. It's got the name of the people in there and everything." Here, and so it was real interesting to find that out, and a little discouraging to think about that. And they had a huge rally that went. It came up and it parked down by Lakeside Cemetery, and they parked their vehicles there. And then they paraded all with their white gowns, men, women, and children, the article says. They walked downtown, and then they went around to 4th Street, and then downtown, came around and went downtown and paraded back up. And then they got into their vehicles, and one of the trucks had a huge cross in it. And they were going to go burn it down by King Midas Mill, which that flour mill is still down there on the south side of town by the Vermilion River. Well, the mayor at the time was James Sebon. He said, no, you're not going to burn that cross in the city limits. And he had the fire department there, and he was all prepared that if they did try to start the fire, they would put it out. And the chaplain of the Ku Klux Klan, that chapter, happened to be, get this, the minister of the Methodist Church, where our black friends are worshiping. How would that feel to know that maybe the people sitting next to you hate you, or else at least if they don't hate you, they think you're not, your skin is dark, you're not equal to me. And so it wasn't a very welcoming place to be for them. And the KKK did not burn the cross in town. They took it out south of Hastings and burned it on a farm. But some crosses were burned, one in Mayor Sebon's yard and one in another man's yard. In fact, my husband Bob and I ended up buying that house and finding out later from a man that his family had lived there when he was a kid, and moved to just down the alley. And he said, so one night he was out camping with his brother, older brother, and his buddies, and he heard these men's voices, and they heard horses' hooves and stuff. And so he said, I was the youngest of the group, and they said, Les, go see what's going on over there. So he said he walked down the alley and went down, and here they were, and they burnt this cross on the yard, and we ended up living in that house later, which was just coincidental but interesting. And so Hastings had some of this undercurrent of discrimination, and but I don't know if hatred's the right word, but at least not welcoming for my enemies. And it's the right word?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I think so. And so, based on all of that, the Curry children, 10 children, out of the 10 children, 9 of them graduated from high school, some of them with higher education. They had more ambitions than to stay in a town that wasn't very welcoming for them. And the same with the Wallace children. They, with the exception of one, ended up moving to Minneapolis and St. Paul. A lot of them to Minneapolis, where their descendants still live today. So it was Yeah, I'm going to tell that part in a little bit. I want to bring in, go back to Alexander Strayhorn, who came to Prescott with Samuel Golden, and he made his home here for the rest of his life. He's buried here at Pine Glen, and he was a former pastor also of Brown's Chapel. And he had when he died, his son Alex was still living, and Alex, his son, married the oldest Wallace daughter. Nellie Wallace was married to Alex Strayhorn. And I'm not quite sure how long they were together, or they never show up on a census record together, but they show up married. I mean, each of them, as their marital status, are married to, and we know that they did get married to each other. But Nellie ended up for a while with some mental health issues, or for some reason she was at Anoka, and she would come back. She owned the family home, and she would come back to Hastings, and then eventually that home was sold, and so was the Curry home sold, and so we have the information from their house records of when that happened. So Samuel Golden stayed very close friends after Mr. Strayhorn died, and Alex went into to serve in the First World War. Strayhorn was the person who put himself down as the closest relative of, Samuel Golden put himself down as the closest relative to Strayhorn. So then in 1954, this was an article that was printed in the Hastings Gazette, that Henry Thomas was age 74 and friend of many, died here Monday. It says, the town's only Negro resident died of a heart attack here at 1:20 p.m. Monday. I grew up going on a farm outside of Hastings, but I came to Hastings to school at the parochial school. So where he lived was only a few blocks from our school, but I never saw him. But Bob remembers seeing Henry Thomas around when he was a kid, because he worked at a gas station. He Simonized cars, and he was known by a lot of people downtown Hastings and well liked. So Hastings really much became a white town after that. There was one family, the Cook family, who Lucy Cook was a granddaughter of Julia and Henry St. Clair that I mentioned earlier, and she married Harrison Cook, who was he also had served in the Civil War, and they lived in Point Douglas. So when they said the only person in Hastings, technically she was not in the city of Hastings. She lived in Point Douglas, and some of our friends remember her as well during their younger childhood. But other than that, seeing a person of color in Hastings just didn't happen when we were children. So 97 years spanned that period of time between the early Barbers that were on the first census record and Henry Thomas in Hastings. And during that time, members of the colored race had fought for their freedom and then their rights as citizens, had celebrated the victory of obtaining those rights, and then joined together in learning more about becoming good citizens. They dreamt of and organized their own church to worship God according to their conscience, without shame or fear, only to have it destroyed by arsons. They watched their children attend and excel in scholarship and sports. Many worked, died, and are buried in Hastings. But their children chose to pursue their own dreams, where there were more opportunities for themselves and their children. So because of Ancestry and the research I was doing, I started seeing people who were also researching the Curry and Wallace families. And Rich Menke was working on, he did a scattering garden at the Lakeside Cemetery, and he named it after James Curry. So it's a Curry scattering garden. And we thought it would be so neat to be able to have a descendant to come, and some of the descendants come and find out about the history that we know about their family. So I reached out on Ancestry. You can write a message to people who are researching the same families you are and connect with them. So I requested, I said, anyone from your family, and I told them about the ceremony and about Lakeside Cemetery. We didn't hear anything from them for a few years. And then we got an answer, and we connected with the family. And so now we have, what I'm showing you here is a picture of the beautiful young woman here is Rebecca Elsie Wallace. I was going to say McWatt. What's Greg's last name?
McMoore.
Isn't that crazy? McMoore. She married a McMoore. And this is Greg McMoore, her grandson, who was part of our group until he got so busy. He does a lot of activities and is very engaged in Minneapolis in the St. Peter's ME Church, where his ancestors ended up, and so did James's. And so we have, this is a photo of 3 or 4 generations that could be on here, because first of all, we have this handsome young man is Charles Curry, who graduated from high school in 1907, and then his son, James Anderson Curry.
No, James Webster.
Oh, James Webster, okay. James Webster. And today, we are fortunate to have James Anderson here. And he is going to tell you all about BR4R. He's chairman of our group. It's called Building Remembrance for Reconciliation. We're focused on memorializing the Browns Chapel that was destroyed by arson. And also we are doing like you are with community conversations. And so James can tell you more about that.
There might be a little overlap here. I'll speak to Hastings Brown history as well as how BR4R came together. But since pictures are exciting, I just thought I'd roll through. We found an ancient, to tie a little bit of Heidi's genealogy that she spoke of, the niece and the Wallaces, and this is the shared, well, it's Phoebe's grandfather and Nancy's father. There's Leduc, if you've never seen him. There was a friendship here between Wallace and the Daniels, as well as, I may as well be full disclosure. Nancy, Phoebe was the offspring of a rape of Nancy. I'm sorry, I should go back. Sorry, I'm already messing up. No, maybe it's coming up. Yeah, this Rhodes Branson raped Phoebe Ellen. He was a slave master, the oral history says, and she was the offspring. But oddly, she was given the last name. I don't know if, and even found in the same home, correct, Heidi? The Branson family, actually a white family, had Phoebe Ella listed as a member of the household, correct?
Well, on the genealogy, they have her listed as his son. As her daughter. As his daughter.
Yeah, so there was some kind of...
But I don't believe she ever, well, we don't know.
Yeah, right, it's speculation. But my oral history that's been come down is that, you know, there's a letter that says Phoebe Ella was raped by her slave master, Rhodes Branson, and Phoebe Ella was the offspring. But it's interesting that she carried the name, I would say.
James, would you speak into the mic? I'd like to hear you, and I can't hear a word.
I'm sorry. Did you catch all that rape business? Sorry about that, Bob. Yeah, moving on. General Leduc. So we've got the aunt, as Heidi mentioned, of Phoebe, living up here in Hastings. I can't say here anymore, it's Prescott. Living over in Hastings, and here is Phoebe and, Phoebe Ella goes by Ella Phoebe and Phoebe over and over again, probably because of out of deference to her mother. But yeah, so that's my great-grandma, my great-grandma and great-grandpa. Just one great. Oh, it's two? Okay. Is it? No, my grandpa is their son. I'm sorry. Weird to defer. So we've the odd or the unique relationship that Heidi and I have is that oftentimes I'm deferring to her about questions about my family. But I won that one. I got I think their roots are in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And to answer the Curry question, Steph Curry's dad is named Dell, and Dell hails from Harrisonburg. So there's the root, or some of the roots of the Curry family are come straight out of Harrisonburg, Virginia. So I can throw that association, but I'm not going to knock on his door and say, "Hey." Nor am I good at basketball. But anyways, they left Hastings. They left Harrisonburg, Virginia. They were kind of childhood sweethearts. And I'm getting some of this history from Ernestine Danforth, a great aunt, or maybe just an aunt. Great either way. Yeah, childhood sweethearts. James joined the Jack Robinson Circus at 16 due to a lost bet where, a bet he won, but a gun was pulled and he needed to leave town, so he and his brother joined the Jack Robinson Circus, which is probably a precursor to Barnum and Bailey, or one of the split-offs at that time. And so he was an active tumbler, assistant, and just kind of an all-around. I bring this up because there's a gentleman named Tom Truax of the Hastings community who enjoyed the friendship that he had with my great-grandpa, and said he could do a standing backflip at age 65. So the tumbling, and I have a cousin that's super limber and gymnastic that way as well. And Phoebe, let's see, I'm not certain of the grandmother that told Katie McWatt. Is anybody familiar with Katie McWatt? Oh, cool, the St. Paulite, of course. I want to say first black female DFL endorsed city council candidate. Didn't win, but she had a childhood experience of kids with jump rope claiming that they would lynch her with the rope, and she came home crying. And I believe it was this grandma that said, don't worry about those kids, you'll make chicken soup out of them. I've also heard oral history that she hated every drop of white blood in her. So that gives credence to the slave master story. They came out of the Shenandoah Valley, which I'd love to visit someday. That's where Harrisonburg is. There was even there was this odd little free pocket, and free is in quotes because I don't know what kind of rights were allowed, but that first gentleman that showed me that kind of old drawing, he owned land and owned a church, and there was this. They say historians are fascinated with this area because it seemed to be a free pocket, and there's been other examples of free states or free areas in the states prior to emancipation. Did I miss anything in that one? Yep. Cool. I think I've got some. I must have some cousins in here, but I'm not sure the source of these photos. But later on, some of these same kids appear with my grandparents. So I'm not sure if they went back. There's record that they went back to Harrisonburg just to visit. And it seems like this seems like sort of the grandparents going back and hanging out with everybody, and their daughters are older. So I think this might be they didn't come to Hastings, and Hastings didn't have this many older black women. So this must have been a reason for the photos, a visit back home. The 5 daughters and 5 sons of Phoebe and James. This one's my grandpa. This one that might be Florence, the valedictorian. And this might be in Hastings, in fact. Finding boyfriends from the cities, chauffeur, I think one was, and a reverend or a pastor was another. And Florence actually married one of the founding members of the Future Farmers of America, which is, or FFA, and I don't know if it's become something else. A new acronym. Okay. And I think Eisenhower or somebody gave him a medal for being one of those early funders. But it's weird, you don't think of FFA having an agricultural, or I mean, you do think of agriculture, but you don't think of a black sort of foundation or founders. Maybe that's to their detriment that they're not acknowledging that. And this was the swimsuit of the day. Perhaps anyone here remember that? But yeah, Buck. I'm sorry. I know my grandpa's Buck. He was known as Chuck and Charles, but I just knew I met Buck a few times. When he was in his retirement home. But yeah, strapping young man. I think he picked up athleticism from his father and taught. They both taught white youngsters and the aged how to swim at Prior Lake. And some other place, Heidi, where he used to vacation, is it Wisconsin? Is it in Wisconsin?
No, it was at Frontenac.
Frontenac.
Went to camp in summers at Frontenac.
Yeah. All right. Doesn't this feel like family slideshows? Forgive me for that. But there's the home that still stands on 5th and River, not Tyler. Just calling it as I see it. You actually know I said Tyler. It's all right. I take the points where I can get them, so I'm just...
You have it coming.
That was our house.
Oh, was it?
Oh, Tyler, that's why she said.
Oh, gotcha.
Bob and I grew up with it.
Gotcha. I believe Gilbert was the only child that didn't graduate, so 9 out of the 10 graduated from Hastings High School. And Bill Spinelli told me that at that time, the graduation wasn't all that high for whites or blacks. I forget what percentage. But I think he may have stayed the way farmers used to keep one son behind to kind of help. There they all are. I want to say this is 1910-ish, 12-ish maybe. Youngest Bill. I've heard my dad refer to Uncle Bill, so I got kissed by Aunt Toots. This was Virginia. They all have sort of like there's a Georgia, there's a Merlin, there's a Virginia, Florence, there's Mary May, Bill, Howard. This is Katie McWatt's dad. And Paul, the young man that was associated with basketball and football management. And Phoebe Ella and James Dabney. Side note, my oral history tells me that we're smoked Irish because somebody used to refer to the Currys as instead of black Irish, we were smoked Irish because the obvious pun. But I think Dabney is even sort of tied to maybe a little bit of Irish history and mixing that we're unaware of. In fact, yeah, I haven't traced the Dabney, but it's there. Oh, I went in. This is kind of nice. There's names I've been throwing out. Those are the graduation dates. And I remember getting kissed by Aunt Toots, because when you're little, you don't want lip kisses. I remember she wanted to kiss me right on the lips. Yeah, so I have the original photo at home. It seems like it was originally that size, and I had it sort of digitized and scanned. We did a reunion. We did a Curry family reunion. Not that it was exclusively Currys, but it was descendants at Minnehaha Falls back in '08. I wonder if I did. So there we go. There's Mom. There's my wife. There's my brother Brian, brother Greg. There's Katie McWatt up there. Aunts and uncles. It was crazy because we didn't know everybody, but sometimes people, at readings are like, "Hey, you're my cousin." Really? I didn't know you from Adam. But so there was the 49 photo that was reproduced of the Browns Chapel congregation. There is a quote here. People seem to think, this comes from Anna Louise Harton, people seem to think there never were many Negroes around here. I recall there were a good many of the colored race, many of whom were good friends and desirable people. I never thought they were different from myself and treated them accordingly. So it seemed like in the 60s, if Hastings had become an all-white town around 54, about 10 years later they started excavating or unearthing their past through the articles a little bit, probably courtesy of Ethel and Ethel Thieling and Hazel, or just some journalist. The Curry family, she said, the Curry family were good, solid church members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now we know that their pastor was a KKK chaplain, which adds an interesting layer. A humorous incident occurred there when some small fry of theirs were christened. This is, Heidi alluded to this story. Augusta Stumpf, sounds like something out of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, was looking after Chester Hodgson, Judge William Hodgson's boy, and as they brought up the first Curry child up the aisle, Chester shouted in a shrill voice, "Oh, a little N-word," and I don't know if it was alliterated for palatability in the 60s in the paper, or if it was her, maybe there was a tongue thing if you had a... Either way, it's an N-word of some kind, surprisingly coming from this child. And then another Curry kid came up and said, "Oh, another little N-word," and he was carried. There's also a portion where the church laughs, or she said that everybody laughed for a little bit, which has got to be rough during your baptism or communion or whatever it was. Rose Hoffenmiller of West 5th Street called and said she enjoyed the article in the Gazette. Her parents who worked for the railroad, were good friends with the Curry family. And when James Curry died, his body lay in state, like the Queen, in the main hallway of Old Central High School. She saw this. Let's see. As Heidi mentioned, they were some of the founders of that church. Their wives were actually signed. The wives are also mentioned in the, but their signatures are there for the initial papers as well, right? Yeah. Yeah, and so let me just fly through this because this was covered. Plenty of Brown's chapels. I think even a John Lewis chapel in, the famous one where they went to after the Edward Pettus Bridge is a Brown's chapel. Yeah, they can't get the date straight, and I'm not faulting them, but the Democrat and the Gazette both have different dates, and forgive me that that's twisted. All right, but they picked up the pieces, and in 1939, this was an anniversary photo of St. Peter's AME in South Minneapolis. I believe the second incarnation of it on Elliott Avenue, which I think it was burned a second time. But I've got my dad in here, and I've got Buck. There's Chuck, and there's even some Wallaces on the side, and my family had triplets. They say the first recorded black triplets. Of course, there were more, but they were kind of exotic. My aunt, Charlotte, Carlotta, and Carolyn. There's the house that Heidi referred to on 5th and River, if anybody feels like visiting. I was happy to see that there weren't any MAGA flags or things in there. But one of the phrases that they say James Curry, Dabney Curry always used to say as a fun little thing was, "How are you feeling?" If someone asked him how he was feeling, he would say, "Simply superfluous." There is a story of electricity going out in the Opera House at Hastings, and everyone was covered in darkness, so he said, "Folks, we're all the same color now." I told you the somersault story, and that Hastings businesses shut down the day he died. He was eulogized by Larry Ho or Larry Hodgson, which is weird because that's a Hodgson that also said the N-word. Yeah. But he said, I owe this man, I can't acknowledge what I owe this man more than I know. Something like that.
It's in the book there.
Is it? Okay. Yeah. It was a pretty heavy statement. I don't know if he was prone to exaggeration, but he was a politician, but a poet as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
He was kind of
I
colorful.
think it came from his heart.
Yeah,
don't think
I
he
do
was-
too.
Yeah.
The three of the Curry boys volunteered for World War I, Paul, Gilbert, and Buck. I have Buck's sword from World War I. Actually, my brother has it in Albuquerque, but I remember growing up with it. Florence was mentioned, and Paul and Wallace. So it was cool when we had that little get together. It was the first time I met a Wallace. I had known of Wallaces being connected to Curry's, but it wasn't until we had that event in Hastings under BR Flora that I was introduced to my long lost cousin. Josie Johnson, Kitty McWatt, daughter of Howard. Howard was a Masonic Lodge secretary. Bill was a World War II veteran. Florence was a valedictorian. Buck was a corporal. Right. Katie, I told you the chicken soup story. Her husband, Arthur McWatt, I was able to get a McWatt fellowship that Heidi alluded to 6 months ago or a year ago, where I was asked to kind of pursue anything historical I was interested in, and I'd already excavated some history with Hastings, so I decided to look at Dakota County, African Americans in Dakota County through the lens of the media. And so I just looked up as many articles as I could. And like Heidi said, luckily there are sort of like black files. Dakota County had one as well, or South St. Paul had one, and so did Farmington. And, so there's a display if anybody feels like going to the Lashy Museum in South St. Paul. And I've got it here somewhere, but there's a panel and a timeline of African Americans in an impressionistic. It's not comprehensive or exhaustive, but articles of tolerance and intolerance, you know, faith communities saying let's help our new citizens, and others doing bastardizations of like the English language as if they were affecting the Ebonics, for lack of a better word, and writing huge articles mocking. So it's interesting, and you also see the population increase and plateau and decrease, and so it's kind of a micro version of tolerance and intolerance in southern, at least in Dakota County. And there she is with Obama. She went to the same school, graduated the same year as my dad. She's got a street named after her. This could have been your community, right? You could be claiming these as your own. Yeah, Georgiana again. Yeah, she went to Brown's Business College. I really feel guilty for like reading accolades of like, see what my ancestors have done, but it's kind of self-evident and I can't help but acknowledge it. Hampton and Tuskegee for Florence. Again, the Curry-Wallace connection, even in the same class. That was Elsie that Heidi referred to earlier, who did this basketball thing. Trying to skip ahead to something more current, but it's coming, so just hold tight. Paul with football, and I don't know if he went into management. He ended up becoming a postman of some renown. I've come across like a letter from Ronald Reagan, about his passing. And some photos. They were musicians, but just because you were a musician in World War I didn't mean you still didn't have to dig holes and do the dirty work. In fact, we all know that SHIT rolls downhill, and it's usually folks of color that have to, or grunts, that have to do the work. And there's Gilbert, and actually I forgot to acknowledge Paul, but he's in the picture as well. Transparency and accountability leads to trust. So this is BR Fora. This was a really quick kind of presentation, but if this sparks conversation, this is kind of what BR Fora is interested in. We've unearthed this history. It sometimes makes people inquire further. We became a 501c3 maybe a year and a half ago, doing the same kind of thing that BIAC is doing. It's neat because it's happening on two fronts parallel, which is really encouraging, and I thank you for your work, and I hope we can get together. What else? There's Mary May. She married one of those chauffeurs, and their grandson became the president of De La Salle High School.
Wow.
Brother Michael Collins, also chair of Minnesota Independent. But I think she was black and Armenian, Georgina Green. now we're just back to Chuck, my uncle Buck, or I'm sorry, my grandpa Buck and his wife Hazel. Since there's a story that since he served in World War I in France, he knew some French. His wife, as a young girl, when she first met him, she said to her girlfriends in French, "Boy, I'd love to kiss that guy on the mouth." And he swept her up on her feet and gave her a kiss because he knew the language. The language of love. He was a postman. They lived on 3836 Fifth Avenue, which is the heart of South Minneapolis, segregated black community. We know that 38th in Chicago is George Floyd Square, so it's just a stone's throw, really. 8 kids. My Uncle Buck evidently used to say, in a manner of speaking, as a preface to a lot of statements he would make. I don't know what that was about, but he also told my dad that whenever my dad was going to him for life advice, he would say, "You'll find out." So when my dad passed in 2016, I put on his gravestone, "You'll find out." I guess I should have put "You found out." But he liked Grain Belt beer, Viceroy, cigarettes, boxing. He made baked beans and sauerkraut. I think from Sweet Hill, I think there were some Germans that, not that he couldn't learn fermentation on his own, but and he used to say "Macht nicht aus," which means "makes no difference." And that carried down to my family. My dad used to say that. Lost his leg to diabetes. And there's Hazel. Hazel was quite the woman. She was the first black female graduate of Davenport's first black female graduate, Davenport, Iowa. Her father, Gentleman Jake, was the first black male graduate of Davenport. He was an escaped slave from Kentucky. Again, the mother of triplets that made Davenport news. Grandma Matilda escaped Kentucky slavery with 9, and then 7 were separated from the family. Jake taught school in Tennessee, and they say among the most highly respected of the black population, and then I found out that he was just a janitor at the library, sleeping a floor sweeper. But it's weird, because James Dabney Curry was just an assistant janitor, so it's weird that they claim so much respect, and regardless of their occupation, which is a nice statement, I guess. Wilberforce, cum laude graduate, my grandma, and a black Rosie the Riveter. If anybody knows that there's a recent discovery in Arden Hills, we had an armament facility for the greatest generation, the Good War, World War II. She was hired as one of those black Rosie the Riveters. By the way, which isn't just sort of working alongside whites, it's usually, again, with poop rolling downhill, you're doing the grunt stuff in the context of working with dangerous chemicals, explosives, stuff that's sort of guinea pig work, almost a Tuskegee kind of situation. Again, maybe not across the board, but not clerical, or not a lot of clerical, easy work. I think this is the, now that I think about it, it's not. I thought this was the same as the Kamala Harris Pearls kind of sorority, that the black sorority that she's associated, Kamala is associated with, but it's not. Gave all her daughters French names. She was a Francophile, evidently, and taught school in Carbondale, Illinois, before she met my grandma. And active in the church. This was called the Jolly 16, evidently, at St. Peter's AME. probably NAACP involved. These are her parents out of Iowa. We believe that we've got some Native American, Blackfoot Indian coming from this line. She's got that sort of Sitting Bull face, but I should say noble. Her mother's name was Fox, and I can't tell if Fox is sort of that thing where you get that indigenous folks have last names that refer to the first thing that was seen upon birth, or if that's just Fox. So it's a question mark. Yeah, there's the second generation after we left Hastings. I refer to it as an exodus. I mean, it seems like the kids moved on to better opportunities and found mates and partners in the cities, as well as a community that of color where there's safety in numbers.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Earlier you talked about sundown towns, and I think it's really important for the white folks here to know about what the sundown town thing meant.
Yeah.
During Jim Crow era and afterwards with the Ku Klux Klan, because until I went to that presentation, I never heard of sundown towns before.
I recorded that presentation so I could share the link with folks of James Lowen, and we got his permission, which is pretty rare, because he usually didn't like his lectures recorded, at least on videos. But I got verbal, and I met the man and made sure it was all kosher. So yeah, I'll send a link, and you can kind of learn straight from the, what's the phrase? The cat, yeah, thank you, horse's mouth, about sundown towns, which he seemed to come around to claim that Hibbing, Hastings, Edina were all, maybe one other, Austin?
Austin.
Yeah, yeah, in his mind met the proof of, burden of proof, I guess, to be qualified as a sundown. And I think I'm wrapping up. Yeah, these are just, as I fly forward here, these are the aunts that I grew up with. They were very vivacious and activists, like as in taking incidents of racism to court, boycotting Woolworths, and this is kind of pre-civil civil rights era. This is sort of 50s. And my dad fought in Korea, but didn't consider himself a soldier. He wrote that on the back of a. What's interesting is sometimes if you look at the back of photos that you have in your album, there's sometimes things that will enlighten you. And he said, "Don't ever call me a soldier." So, but he still went to DC and was involved in the Korean War memorial. And now that I think about it, I've got a Wisconsin godfather. His name is Anderson Connor, and I think they're the Connor family that owned something in Marshfield, some tool, grocery stores and tools and general stores. So that's my only Wisconsin connection. A white man that my dad saved in Korea. Became my godfather. And that's the Anderson, James Anderson. Did you know that story, Heidi? Mm-hmm. And there's Mom and Dad. So let me just show you a quick little thing about Mom for the Caucasians in the room. So you can relate. This is the garden in Hastings, Lakeside Cemetery. My other half is Irish, English, German. I want to say, Doherty, Kiesling, these are some of the names. They say they go back to the Mayflower. I have a cousin, a cousin that's done the research. I'm related to Gregory Peck and George Bush. And then I had an uncle named Bud, who was an indexer and was involved in the writing of Richard Nixon's memoirs. And I paid a visit. I'm not throwing this in. I'm throwing this in for a little anecdotal or apocryphal story. When I was a kid and I was visiting Nixon's, what's it called? His compound in San Clemente. Thank you. I was a kid, so I was 7 or 8 or whatever. My mom went into this room and made sure that I got to see, this is where Nixon's cabinet is. And I was going, what about these cabinets is so interesting? But yeah, I was locking into the cabinets of his conference room, and not until later did I figure out that she was probably referring to this is where his cabinet meets. So I'm not the best at telling those kind of jokes, but as a kid, when you hear a word and only know one version of it, yeah. And then, in fact, that's Bud and my dad. So we lived out in Brooklyn Park. We got the home after '68 when they stopped, when there were federal laws against covenants. But I also think that the homeowner wanted to upset his neighbors by selling to an interracial couple. Samardage was his last name. On the Doherty side, Bruce Doherty from 1947, a running back that my dad actually knew before he met my mother. And there's the Dohertys. They came out of Wayzata. There's my mom and rough and ragged Irish family, owned a deli or a meat store. So yeah, it was a weird kind of Wayzata, Minneapolis. Interracial marriages weren't all that popular in the 50s, so they met at a place called Dreamland on the corner of 4th and 36th. 38th. Yeah. And that's it. Sorry for unloading all the accolades, but I've strung that into some kind of presentation for you. I hope it was interesting.
But my understanding from his presentation, after the Civil War, a lot of freed slaves came up here because they were farmers, and so they took farmland. They integrated kind of all over, and it was the Jim Crow phenomenon that
the north, yeah,
right, that came up north and said these two populations should be separate.
Yeah, and it manifested itself in different ways. Sometimes sirens would go off. Sometimes there were signs as you entered town. Sometimes it was just, rumor about the town, or, we all know Emmett Till, who visited the South, although it's not a Sunday story, but you could, any kind of slight infraction might spur intolerance. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I may be jumping to conclusions, but I don't know if you've ever noticed in that little article from the Hastings Gazette about the arson, but I learned from my father, who taught journalism, that journalists pay a lot of attention to words that they use. And what that article says is the name of the arsonists were never revealed. It doesn't say they were not known, it says they were not revealed. And I kind of wonder whether maybe that journalist had somebody who said, well, I'll tell you off the record who those people were, but you can't publish it. And he didn't want to lose his sources. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I assume there were certainly some people in Hastings.
Oh, I'm sure they knew who burned it. They just, I believe they knew. I believe they knew who burned the church, but they just
Complicity of
didn't publish
silence.
it.
That's where that silence equals violence thing actually makes sense. If you've ever seen that.
They just didn't have an internet to broadcast it, so
That's
it was
right.
a small
Or radio or television or.
But one thing, Heidi didn't mention that prior to that church burning, I think there was some kids that rang a bell. Was it prior?
Oh, so, yeah, well, one of the things that was brought up, because when we first started talking about this openly, people didn't want to hear about it. They said, oh, it was just some kids playing around, it was just, how kids play with fire and stuff, and didn't want to have any kind of connotation that it was racist or anything about hatred and discrimination. They didn't want that to be part of the story. So I started looking, like I said, we looked at all the articles. Well, not too far, I think it was even before this, there were 3 boys got into the Presbyterian church and rang the bells. They got in trouble. They got taken before a judge. And everybody knew who they were. So it wasn't just that, oh, these are little kids, so we're not going to talk to them about it or anything. It was definitely a difference between a white church having their bells rang and a black church being burnt, destroyed by arson.
What was the population of Hastings in 1910?
I'm not good at
Couple
that.
thousand? Couldn't have been much more.
Oh, yeah, more than that even.
I was just curious, the land where that church was,
Yes.
what is it now?
Oh, okay, so that was interesting. It sat empty for quite a while, and then it got sold to
Grouse.
Grouse had a lumber yard there when we were children, and he bought it for $300, but it sat empty for a while. I'm going to look at that property through Dakota County, the county. You can go look at the records. And I'm curious to know who it was sold to, who got the money,
Louis Ranch got the duplex there. Louis Ranch.
Well,
Wasn't it?
well, no, his is across the street. There, now, at the current time, the lumber yard was taken away, and currently there is a duplex there.
That's the Watergate thing of following the money. Yeah, I thought of that too.
I would just like to respond to the FFA part of that discussion.
Sure.
Having read about the discrimination against African Americans in the distribution of funds after the
Freedmen's
Korean
Bank.
War,
Oh, okay.
that there were agricultural programs where people could get help, but the African American people could not get those funds.
Wow.
Yeah, that seems par for the course. doesn't it? Yeah, yes, definitely.
In our group, a couple weeks ago, Char invited all of us to come to this meeting today and to talk about the idea of communities being accepting and welcoming to all kinds of folks. I grew up in Point Douglas, and when I told Char the story, she said, "You've got to come and tell your story."
Yes,
And James, you're going to relate to this because the only woman in our community who was black was a gal named Lucy Kangas. And Lucy, if you're familiar with the St. Croix Trail going up by the apple orchards and whatnot up there, okay, she had a property that overlooked the Lake St. Croix and the beaches down there. And she rented that from Tom Carpenter up at Carpenter's Nature Center. Anyhow, as a community and growing up, I feel so lucky to have been a part of that because my contact with Lucy, I was probably 7, 8 years old, summertime, and my brother and I would go up that trail up towards the orchards, and of course the place we went to was Lucy's garden. Lucy was always out gardening. She had a small, I can't even call it an acreage, but large enough to have a really large garden. And when we would come up the road and she'd see us, she'd either come to the door or out of her garden and say, "Come on in, we got lemonade and cookies all set for you." She was a loving person and a part of our community as much as anybody else. And I would wish that all of our communities could accept people like that into our community. So I call it my I Love Lucy show.
That's the zinger.
Thank you.
Good.
Very good.
That article you put up there with Jim Klobuchar was the.
Oh, yeah, yes, yeah.
You might be interested in knowing that his daughter will be the first woman president of the United States. Yeah, because they'll never butcher her like they butchered Hillary Rodham. That ain't gonna happen.
Are you gonna open that up now?
Yeah, you're talking about population, how large Hastings was, and you've talked about the community, the black community in Hastings. At its height, what would the population, do you think, approximately would it have been at that time?
Of the black people?
Black, yeah.
Yeah, 40. The largest number marked on the census was 40.
So less
And
than
that was in 1870.
Okay.
And then, of course, in between,
3,500 at that time.
in between, of course, there were people that would come and go. And so we'll find names in articles or referred to that aren't on the census records. But that's what was on the,
Less than 100.
Out of
yeah,
total,
less than
how many
100, always
people
less than
total?
100.
40 out of what?
Well, I was going to
2,000?
look at my article. I actually included the numbers of whites and blacks in, when I wrote my articles about it. But that was in 2018. I don't remember all the numbers like that.
So if I was to put my head in the space of what could have led to the terrorist act or hate crime of arson, so the church probably was pulling folks from Prescott, pulling folks from Trimbelle, pulling them from Point Douglas, and had a raucous young female pastor, or fiery, and there was this idea of white inferiority having a problem with a thriving black congregation. Also, this idea of, well, my tolerance level, 8% is okay in my town, but when you get into 9s and 10s, and I just pulled that 8 from like an Aspen Institute actually had a study of towns. When white flight begins, it's sort of around 8%. But so yeah, if besides, it's not clan related, which is interesting. I mean, unless it's sort of like early. It's prior to Birth of a Nation, so that's 1915, the film, which glorified the Klan, although it did have its previous incarnation, but there was then this Reconstruction era version that was in the Senate. Yep, actually D.W. Griffith. That's okay. I teach film, so. So yeah, it's the neighbors. If I'm not better than my neighbor, and if I have low self-esteem or an inferiority complex, and I see that kind of ascendancy or prosperity, and 300 people on the lawn, and so.
I was going to say the church that I was part of, when the black church came and joined our white church, there was, it was okay for a month, and then you had people who were uncomfortable with it because it had become roughly half and half. And so we held, a round table discussion to say the positives about it and the negatives about it. But there was just some people that could not deal with it, and so they left that church. I mean, the church is still.
That's like, wasn't there a school meeting where a guy said, is diversity, could that be a bad thing? Too much diversity be a bad thing?
Yeah, just recently.
Yeah. So the 18 census record in Hastings, the number was 3,458 people, and out of that only 40 were colored. So it was a very small population.
Still enough to be noticeable.
There was, yes, it was, because 40 people, and they had businesses downtown, and they were very obvious. It was a more concentrated.
There was a lot of Native American Indians in town when I was a kid. I was a kid in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
Well,
So
I have a
anyway.
story thin on details. Maybe somebody knows it
better than I because I barely know it. Anyway, the Boy Scout troop of Prescott was doing their annual summer camp at Camp Tomahawk. And I'm going to say this is 1950, give or take 30 years. That's how thin I've been. They had one black member, and they got up to camp and they said, no, he can't be here. And the troop said, well then we're going home too. And so ultimately it was, they limited this scouts where he could go that week and what he could do in the context of a greater, influx of scouts. But at least his troop stood up for him, I guess, as much as they could. So that's, and like I said, really thin on details, and like the date would be great to know.
Sure.
Anyway, I heard that from an old scout.
Heidi, didn't Greg McMore of the Wallace family say that Bill McMore, when he was a running back with the Gophers, and there was a Southern game, and they weren't going to allow him, the coach then just took the team
pulled
back.
the team out of the, and that was written up, in the Minneapolis paper,
So as a person of color myself, I've noticed, the odd, peculiar contradiction of race relations where you can excel, like in Ellen Page and Prince and Katie and Josie, and you've got sort of the exotic, talented 10th that can ascend. And is even encouraged. I mean, Hastings invested in that church as well. They took subscriptions. So there was white residents that invested in that church.
Originally, they did. They contributed to
Right.
it.
And yet still collectively,
Well,
it's that.
someone didn't like it.
Right. But I mean, the silence, like you said,
Yes,
either
that's what I mean.
there may have been private condolences given, but
There could have been, but we don't know that.
the courage to actually, or the journalist,
Publicly.
or the whole outing of the source might have repercussions.
You might be interested in we were talking about Red Blake's staff. Red Blake was the head coach of Army, U.S. Military Academy. They were the #1 team in the nation in the 40s. They had the running backs. It was inside, outside. It was Ben Davis and Doc Blanchard. On that staff, in the early 50s, Red Blake's son was involved in a scandal. And the scandal was that the code of ethics at West Point was that if you knew somebody that was cheating, you had to turn them in. If you didn't turn them in, you violated the code. There was a young couple of kids that were cheating on a test. They copied somebody's paper. They didn't turn them in. They found out about it. Red Blake's son was kicked off the staff. Was kicked out of football. On that staff were a couple of guys, a guy by the name of Tom Landry, and pro football wound up taking the Dallas Cowboys. There's a young fellow there by the name of Vince Lombardi, who was from Florida, who was on the staff there. And there was another fellow on there by the name of Murray Warmath. So Tom Landry went to the Giants. Vince Lombardi went to the Giants, and Murray Warmath went to the college program in Tennessee. And at the time, most of the Gophers were pretty much all white at that time. Murray Warmath came up from Tennessee and took over from Wes Fessler. And the first thing that Murray did was he started to recruit good football players. And the good football players came out of Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Maybe you remember Sandy Stevens, Judge Dixon, maybe a little fellow by the name of Bobby Bell. And the Gophers went from being the doormats of the league in the late 50s to being national champions in 1960, 1961. So Vince takes over the Packers, Tom Landry takes over the Cowboys, and Murray Warmath came in. Murray was a very interesting man. As a matter of fact, we had him one of our guest speakers at the athletic banquet. It would have been 1974, I think, down at the Steamboat. And God, he was good. He was really, really good. And he told some of those stories. Alan Page went to Notre Dame, and of course he's the judge
former Supreme Court Justice.
Yes, and I'm sure you've met him several times.
I met him 3 days ago.
Is that right? And he's fantastic, man. You sit there and
Yeah,
just,
maybe
you're
I should-
mesmerized by the guy.
Maybe I should, can I show one more thing?
Oh, please do. God, yes.
It's not a slide, but if anybody likes the library system of Minneapolis Public Library, Alan Page and his wife,
Yeah.
Diane Past,
Yes.
have a exhibit that even the Smithsonian recognizes as having works of the Jim Crow era that they'd never seen before. And it's really powerful. It's I think this is one of the original signs after Abe Lincoln passed that was held by black advocates of his administration. But there's a flip side to this too, but you'll have to see it at the Central Library. So it's there till the 29th. I don't work for the library, but this Testify exhibit is being put on by Alan Page's daughter. And
His private collection.
Downtown Central Library, 3rd in Hennepin, 300 Hennepin. So,
Very interesting.
yeah.
Very interesting.
Hey, thanks for everybody showing up.
Thank you.